Hello and welcome to Maximum Bon Jovi, the first talking book about the band. It was written and researched by Martin Harper, music is by Amanda Thompson, and it's read by Nancy McLean. You can check out our full catalogue on our website at www.chromedreams.co.uk, where you can also join our Maximum Collectors Club to receive special offers and free CDs. Alternatively, join the Maximum Collectors Club by filling in the registration form attached to the booklet inside this CD and post it back to us.
It's not necessarily the place, New Jersey. It's the same thing as I imagine Sheffield to be, or Liverpool to be, or Pittsburgh or Cleveland here in the States for point of reference. It's a place where you're from, but it's an attitude that you carry around with you. It's a way to walk and talk and breathe and be. And if it entails that loyalty, or if it entails that. I think I said it best when in Stick to Your Guns. I said the words, when you spit, you better mean it.
During the 70s, British rock bands ruled the world of music. With the demise of the Beatles, the Rolling Stones had become the most popular band in the world. Led Zeppelin, the world's first heavy metal superstars, followed closely behind. Other British bands like Yes and Black Sabbath managed to move vast amounts of records across the world, outselling the pop acts of the day. In contrast, popular American bands remained in the minority, even in their home country. Only Aerosmith, whose roots were firmly in Stone-style rock and roll, managed to come close to the status of the British bands. By the 80s, much of the British rock scene had run out of steam. The Stones had descended into drug-fueled mediocrity, Led Zeppelin lost a member and split up, whilst other bands simply faded away, unable to change, becoming obsolete and forgotten. It was time for the American bands to take over. US rock quickly became the most popular force in music. Van Halen, Poison, and Guns N' Roses were the most successful rock bands of the decade, scoring countless hit singles and platinum albums. Hundreds of so-called hair or cock rock bands followed in their wake, all playing the same kind of melodic heavy metal. This was where Bon Jovi found their first success. Proving themselves a cut above the rest of the American rock scene, they soon achieved worldwide popularity. The movement was over by the mid-1990s. The most successful bands of the genre had imploded under their own internal pressure, or had continued on to become much-mocked relics of a bygone era. Out of the handful that survived, only one has managed to keep up the same levels of success: Bon Jovi.
It's a long road, you know. I'm not going anywhere. You want to come along? It's gonna be a hell of a trip.
Jon Bon Jovi was born John Francis Bon Jovi on March 2nd, 1962. His father, also called John, was a hairdresser, while his mother Cindy was a housewife, whose main claim to fame came from having been a Playboy bunny in the 70s. Like most of the children in his area, John attended the Sayreville Memorial High School, where he proved himself to be a clever but somewhat willful child. His grades were good, but there was always the suspicion that he could do a lot better if he wasn't so busy trying to impress girls. He came from a musical background, with several family members being amateur musicians. His biggest influence was his cousin Tony, who played in many high school bands, becoming something of a local celebrity. Following in his cousin's footsteps, John took up the guitar and quickly began writing his own songs. His interest in music led him to meet the boy who would soon become his best friend, a young guitar player by the name of Dave Sabo. Like John, Dave grew up in Sayreville and attended the high school. After hearing Dave talk about his aspirations to become a rock and roll star, John realised that he had met a kindred spirit. Before long, Dave and John had made a pact. If one of them became a star before the other one did, he would help his friend as much as possible. Jon made it to the big time first and honoured their bargain by inviting Dave's band to support them on tour as much as possible. Dave himself would find a good degree of success with his band, which would be called Skid Row. The two did their best to get into bands. Jon found more immediate success, with many local groups being impressed by the power of his voice. Before long, he was in great demand as a singer, and from the age of 14 he was in one band or another. Sometimes these bands would be short-lived affairs, lasting only a month or so, but others achieved a reasonable degree of success. Jon's commitment to his musical ambitions is made clear from one incident in particular. For most of his 16th year, he was the singer for a 10-piece R&B group called The Rest, who'd been attracting a fair amount of attention in the local area. This attention won them the opening slot at a show with Hall & Oates, who were at that point an incredibly successful act. Unfortunately, the show conflicted with Jon's high school prom night, the most important day in his young life. However, he chose to miss the prom night dance and play the Hall & Oates show. Although many of his classmates thought he was stupid for missing the dance, Jon could only think of the exposure his band would get from the show, which was sold out. Unfortunately, The Rest folded soon afterwards. But Jon soon found work with a number of other bands, finally joining the Atlantic City Expressway, who opened for Bruce Springsteen and Squeeze, but failed to find further success. Frustrated, the members went their separate ways. Jon himself gave up the idea of joining a band for a while, preferring to concentrate on his songwriting. In order to keep the money coming in, he took a job at the record plant, a prestigious New York studio where his cousin Tony worked. It was only a cleaning job, but it did give Jon the opportunity to use the equipment for free after the regular musicians had finished work. This wasn't always perfect, because the studio might be booked up until the early hours of the morning, but Jon would be there, waiting to record his songs. One of these, Runaway, would eventually find its way onto Bon Jovi's first album. It wasn't long before he realised that he needed a band if his music was to develop. The first recruit was an old friend of his who'd been in many of the same groups and had experienced the same frustration with a lack of progress. David Bryan, a 21-year-old keyboard player, had grown up in the same area as Jon, and they'd been friends at school. When he heard Jon was looking for musicians, he immediately volunteered his services. Pooling their knowledge, the pair came up with a list of suitable guitar players and drummers that might be interested in forming a new band. They didn't have to look far. New Jersey at that point was home to many out-of-work musicians that had headed north in the hope of finding their fortune. Among them were Richie Sambora, a 24-year-old guitarist with a love of Jimi Hendrix and Led Zeppelin, and Alec John Such, a renowned local bass player. Richie and Alec had achieved a reasonable degree of success with their band Message, but internal friction had pulled them apart. Hearing the early demos of Jon's songs, they happily agreed to join. The last person on board was Tico Torres, at age 30, the oldest of the group. He'd been playing in local acts for about 12 years and had a reputation as a precise and proficient drummer. The band was Jon's project and would be called Bon Jovi. In a couple of months, thanks to his tireless efforts, they had secured a record deal with the Mercury label. The record company's executives were impressed with Jon's early recordings and managed to get Runaway included on a compilation of unsigned bands, even though Bon Jovi had already been signed. Meanwhile, they began touring extensively, even securing a place supporting heavily bearded Texan rockers ZZ Top. The tour lasted for several months in 1983, and by November, the band were sent into the studio to begin recording their first album, simply called Bon Jovi. The record did not do well though, despite receiving some positive reviews. The only single released from it barely scraped into the US top 50, and Bon Jovi were encouraged to continue touring. The next 18 months followed much the same pattern. Most of 1984 was spent on the road, with occasional breaks to work on their second album, which was due for release in May of the following year. 7,800 degrees Fahrenheit fared better than its predecessor, but still not well enough to push the band into the big league. In later years, it would earn them their first gold disc, but for now it only secured them a handful of favourable reviews. The singles also failed to achieve much success, although Hardest Part Is the Night did become their first single to enter the UK Top 100. The following year would see their career truly take off, beyond their wildest expectations.
Slippery was more grown up than Fahrenheit. Fahrenheit was better than the first one, you know? So I think that it's just the next logical step for us.
The first single from Bon Jovi's third album was released in September 1986 and entered the UK Top 20 immediately. You Give Love a Bad Name would grow to be an 80s rock classic and one of the band's most enduring hits. It topped the American singles chart upon its release in November, and by that time the album had begun its meteoric rise. Slippery When Wet would soon become one of the most successful rock albums of the 80s, beaten only by AC/DC's Back in Black and Guns N' Roses' Appetite for Destruction. Mostly written by Jon Bon Jovi, Richie Sambora and professional songwriter Desmond Child, the album is a classic of the melodic rock field. Desmond Child has also worked with Bryan Adams and Aerosmith, although his most successful work was with Bon Jovi. The album showcased Jon's gruff but impressive vocal talents, supported by powerful rock riffs and a keen sense of melody. It provided the band with 4 singles, all of them worldwide smash hits, and managed to reach the top spot in the US album chart twice, returning to the position 3 months after its initial release. While their third album was selling phenomenal amounts across the world, Bon Jovi were kept occupied with their most extensive tour yet. Covering all corners of the globe, including a large number of shows in the Middle East, the Slippery When Wet tour was one of the highest grossing of the year, breaking several box office records. Although the early shows went well, the band were unused to such a heavy schedule and quickly became fatigued. By January 1987, it was obvious that they could not continue at such a pace and returned home for a welcome rest. The break was short-lived, however. The second single to be released from the album, Living on a Prayer, entered the US charts at number 1, providing Bon Jovi with their biggest hit, and it remains their most successful single to date. This very success forced the band to return to touring, as they were now one of the most important rock acts in the United States. The biggest date of the tour was the annual Monsters of Rock festival at Castle Donington in England. This event was for many years the most important date in the metal calendar. There was usually some stiff competition for the headlining spot, which was often given to a long-standing band such as AC/DC or Iron Maiden. Bon Jovi were incredibly pleased to be given the main slot, playing over bands with a much longer history than themselves. The other acts in the lineup were Anthrax, WASP, Dio and Cinderella, all popular bands at the time, although none of them managed to repeat that success in the 90s. Of all the bands at Donington in 1987, only Bon Jovi have remained a consistently high-selling act. The Castle Donington show was a triumphant success, with Bon Jovi proving that they were not just some studio-bound corporate rock band. Despite many years of touring, rumours had been circulating in Europe that they were a record company manufactured product, with no real ability or talent. That one English show killed these speculations, forcing even the most sceptical critic to admit that Bon Jovi's success was no fluke. The 4th annual MTV Video Awards in September earned the band even more honours for their live shows. Living on a Prayer was voted Best Stage Performance, with the band being nominated in 2 other categories as well, something that would happen many times throughout their career.